Don't lie. How much do you actually know about NDIS Support Coordination? Have you ever looked at your NDIS plan and felt lost or confused? Have you ever attempted to find legal aid to help you with an Administrative Appeals Tribunal? Well, here's the thing. When you don't know what something is, you don't know what questions to ask. This is the third episode where we've talked about the NDIS, because for as long as it's been around, there have been so many situations where NDIS participants feel lost, don't know what to ask for, or don't know how to interpret the changes. It doesn't matter if it's your first plan, or your fifth plan, or maybe even more. The NDIS is a complicated beast.
Hi, I'm Louise. I'm one of the Senior Community Services Coordinators at Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. I've been working here for 5 years now, and I have been working in the community services industry for 15 years.
Yep. Hi, I'm Mel Gorman. I'm one of the other Senior Community Services Coordinators. I've been working at SCIA for the last 6.5 years.
Hi, I'm April. I'm an NDIS Appeals Advocate, working mainly in the AAT. I've been with SCIA for 2 years now, and I love it here.
In this episode, Louise, Mel, April and myself talk about how NDIS support plans seem both too broad and somehow too specific, how educating NDIS planners and local area coordinators can really benefit participants, how all of these combined contribute to everyone getting NDIS burnout, and the inaccuracies behind the phrase NDIS blowout. It feels like with each episode, explaining the NDIS gets more and more complicated, but we hope this episode gives you enough that you can make your own informed choices. Okay, so we're talking NDIS, we're talking government policy, we're talking disability today. And for people who might not know about what support coordination is either Mel or Louise, do you want to explain what a support coordinator is in regards to the NDIS?
So a support coordinator is someone that is funded by the NDIS in a specific support category to help people understand their plan, how they can use their funding, what services they can access, and to also help them link to services that they need, because it can be really challenging to know what providers out there are ethical, what providers have the right, experience to meet a particular client's needs. Especially we find like a lot of OTs don't know how to script a wheelchair. So for us, we have that experience in-house we've worked with a bunch of different OTs around scripting wheelchairs. So we have a really good idea of who has really good skills in that area, and we can give someone options and then they can choose who of those options is the one that fits best personality-wise with them. It's kind of like a personal assistant for your NDIS plan.
I mean, that is a good way to explain it. You also look for different services, like such as, if you needed something like a dietitian or, just a holistic kind of approach to the NDIS, because I guess a lot of people come into the NDIS, they might not even know what a support coordinator is.
With support coordination, it's not just about the NDIS funding. So for example, we've got a recent client who's newly injured, and his wife has identified that their GP is upstairs, and while there is a lift, he is in a pretty bulky power wheelchair, so he's not actually going to be able to get out of the lift and into the doctor's practice. So it's negotiating with that family's GP of, when he's out of hospital, are you prepared to do home visits so that he can maintain that continuity of care with the GP? It's actually whole of life, not just NDIS, that we support with. Because
you go basically above and beyond the NDIS, what are some issues that can arise without support coordination?
I think what we find with participants who don't have support coordination is that sometimes they're left quite unsupported with their NDIS plan. So particularly if it's their first time receiving an NDIS plan, they might somewhat end up falling through the cracks as their plan sort of progresses. So we find that if they don't have support coordination, they're usually supported by a local area coordinator. And in some cases, they just don't have the time or the capacity to help somebody to fully implement an NDIS plan, or to help them link up with the supports and services that they need. So quite often we find participants reaching out to us for assistance because they have just sort of found themselves falling through the cracks and needing that extra support, which normally a support coordinator would provide if they're funded the service.
Have you come across people who have probably been even 2-3 plans in who didn't have a support coordinator, didn't have access to things that they probably should have?
I mean, it is something we commonly see. Yeah, people come to us and they just have no idea, or they're not fully achieving what they could be. So another client that I've been working with recently, she and her husband didn't realize they could have care on the weekends. So her husband has just been doing everything and not actually having a break from working full time. And then also, like, he can't get her out in the community on his own. So they just sit in their house together every weekend and don't go out. When I was talking to him this week about, but why are you doing that? Like, you could absolutely be going out. Even if you have a carer in the house and you go out on your own to have a break, or, you know, they can take your wife out and you can sit in the house on your own and read a good book. And he was like, oh, that would be really nice. Like, he just hadn't had someone say that that was an option.
The other time that we sort of notice this come up is if somebody's had a recent change to their situation and they maybe previously were managing without a support coordinator, but suddenly something drastic changes in their life and they don't know what to do from here. So perhaps they've had changes to their informal supports, or a housing situation that's changed. Maybe they've found themselves with a wound that's now changed a number of things in their life, perhaps their equipment needs, their care, maybe they're in hospital, whatever it is, and suddenly they need a support coordinator. So that's another time where we do see people fall through the cracks again if they don't have a coordinator already and suddenly they experience this significant change and they've got nobody to help them sort of navigate what to do next.
Absolutely. When they come to us for advocacy, sometimes they don't have support coordination and it falls on the advocate to try and get that and help that person link up with services. But then you have the underutilisation of funding and the problem that they go into a review with no support coordinator to help get all the documents ready for the review or the evidence of what they need to justify the reasonable and necessary criteria, and they end up losing that funding. And it's something that is seen often, and support coordinators are so valuable to the participants.
Very rudimentary and just based on my own plan, really. So there's a whole bunch of silos that pockets of money are put into. They're not interchangeable. And when you explain this to somebody who is not a part of the NDIS, because I guess the first thing that you might say is, I don't have enough funding in such and such area. Well, then do you have enough funding in another area? Yeah. Can't you just move that over? No.
I think it kind of, when you're talking about like the funding bucket that's used for allied health, I think to a degree it does come down to the NDIS trying to control how people are spending that money. Like, they have very firm ideas on how much physiotherapy, for instance, is reasonable over a year. And so they will only fund that amount of physiotherapy. And by having it in its own isolated budget, where you can't top it up from anywhere, means that people don't have that choice to go, actually, I need like 2 or 3 extra sessions.
What we do find happens is that when people get their plan back, it comes back into monetary value. So they may have gone into their plan review meeting requesting, for example, 3 hours of care a day, not knowing what that equates to in a dollar value. So we do often come up with this when somebody gets a plan approved. I suppose part of our role as support coordinators is to help the participants who understand their budgets and whether it is going to help meet their needs. But again, if they don't have that support from a coordinator, quite often we find that they don't get the breakdown of their NDIS plan from their local area coordinator, and they are left to sort of try to work out whether their funding is suitable for them on their own.
My experience is that I find people get overwhelmed when they see like all the different budget categories and they've got different names in the paper plan to what they have on the NDIS portal. So that's in itself is like really confusing for people that, on the plan it says improved health and well-being, but in the portal it will say capacity building, health and well-being, but they're the same bucket of money. So people get really confused about that. And if you don't know the system, how are you supposed to interpret that? People also get really confused about core and how, even though it's kind of divided into 3 budgets, it doesn't actually matter what the NDIS says. So if the NDIS says you've got $1,000 for consumables and you've got $50,000 for your daily care needs and then maybe $10,000 for community access, if you actually don't feel you need support for community access, but you need more than $1,000 worth of consumables, then you can move the budgets around. That's a really hard concept for people to grasp a lot of the time. And so I think it would almost be easy just to kind of go like, here is your core funding. These are the things you can use it for, rather than having it split into like these three categories that make it harder, because none of the other categories really get split. Like even your improved daily living, even though it's for allied health, it's not split into like, this is your OT funds and this is your physio funds and this is your exercise physio funds. It's just, this is for allied health. This is how we, the NDIS planner, have interpreted your needs and the hours that we've given for each service. But if you decide not to, say, get a piece of assistive tech assessed this year, you can use that for extra physiotherapy if you want to. So it's not broken down the same way on paper.
The LAC takes your needs to a planner. Have you noticed any sort of like commonalities between the way that planners approach different types of disabilities and how much funding that is assumed for a certain type of disability? Or has there been any anomalies, I guess, for certain situations that have even had underfunding or like maybe they've given a lot of funding to something that just didn't seem like you would even get funding for?
So the thing I find really interesting about that is that under ADDIC, when I was working in day programs and we were taking on school leavers, that people basically got funded on how many days they were going to come. And it was like a pretty standard, if you were in a wheelchair with an intellectual disability, you would get, I think, $150,000 a year, say, for day programs only. If you were quite independent and maybe had just a mild intellectual disability, it was significantly less. So ADDIC kind of had the same system, but it was absolutely open and clear to at least day program providers. And I think the family got communication. It's a while ago now, so I can't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure the family got a letter saying like, you've been funded for day programs once you leave school for 3 days per week at X amount per year. It was really open. It was really transparent. The family could go back and say, oh, but you've forgotten about X. And if someone was on an individual support package, the same kind of thing. This person's going to get this much money for the year, and this is what supports we think that they're going to need. But when it transitioned into the NDIS, all of that openness went away until you get the plan. But you could see, like in day program especially, we could see a lot of consistency across like our clients. Whereas now it's all kind of smoke and mirrors.
When we talk about what a standard maybe spinal cord injury support might be funded, the things that we find coming up a lot recently are things that are getting standardized. So it might be expected that somebody has a standard level of care when in fact they need a level 2. And that has a really big impact on their funding package, because the support workers need to be trained to that higher level to perhaps provide bowel care or whatever it is that maybe diabetes management or whatever the support worker needs that additional training for. And if that's not sort of picked up by the planner through all the reports that are provided, it can just get funded at that standard level, which does have, like I said, a really big impact on their supports.
The typical support package that's been trending lately on social media, and I had a look into it and I found the NDIS's guidelines from ourguidelines.ndis.gov.au.
Well, what does that mean? According to this document, the typical support package gives them an indication of what supports they would usually expect to be included in your plan based on situation and disability support needs. Each support must be reasonable and necessary. You know that phrase, as a package of supports, because they approve the whole plan, not just individual supports in isolation. So the typical support package helps guide the validation process. April goes on.
This appears to be a computer-generated system to obtain a plan funding guide. The typical support package also helps to guide the consistency of our decision-making process. We use these to check your overall plan and to make sure that all your supports make sense together and that your support types and amounts will complement each other to help you fulfill an ordinary life. We may then increase or decrease your funding based on our decision with any reports and information we have. So the typical support guide, you can't get their numbers. And so it's something that they use to help calculate how much a person's disability should be funded for. You, under FOI or anything, you can't, that is an internal decision made by the NDIS, and they do not release these numbers of the typical support guide.
This also carries into, if we can't see the transparency of funding, Then there is the NDIS price guide, and the NDIS price guide, which sets the price according to the supports that you can get, rises every year. Some of the issues that can occur with getting to the stage of the NDIS is that you've gone to all the effort of getting all of your paperwork together, all of your reports together, and you've submitted it and you're waiting for the plan, and the plan comes back to you and it's drastically underfunded or not funded. If you're somebody who requires, a service at a price point that was set by the NDIS, and then that is a requirement for you, and they've either reduced the funding or declined the funding, the price guide really does affect how the NDIS plans work. And it's something that's quite interesting to your point, April, about how we don't even know what the transparency level behind people's disabilities are. So now it's almost like you're trying to get them to believe that the disability really does need that level of support. This could be problematic for people who are it doesn't even matter if they're entering into the NDIS, this could be their third, fourth plan.
Early on, I walked into a planning meeting with a really well-educated client, and the planner said to us, he had essentially built the plan before the meeting. And this was in the days that they said they didn't have calculators and they didn't make assumptions around what people needed, and they waited for you to talk to them. This planner actually said to us, we had you down as C5 level of injury, but we see you C4, so I've added that extra $20,000 into your plan.
I had through a reviewable decision process recently where I had a planner call me sort of questioning the hours of support that was being requested and the function of the individual. And once we sort of were able to explain, so in this particular case, the planner was questioning why the client can drive their power wheelchair, but they can't change their colostomy bag. If they've got the hand function to drive their wheelchair, why can't they perform this other task? But once we kind of explain around the OT report and their functional capacity, and they actually got to have that discussion outside of reading the reports, which we hope that they read, just through that education and having that discussion about this is why it's needed. In this case, it was a really good outcome for the participant, and they were funded, adequately for everything that they needed. It was just, a shame that we had to go through that whole process initially, and it wasn't recognised when the first plan was built. That I suppose that is a bit of a good story with how they can adapt the way that they do the funding, as long as you've got a planner that is understanding and can interpret the information.
When people get a really good discharge plan from hospital and then they come home and their community supports are set up well and they're working well and they have a really good transition home, it does flow on to, they have the energy and the time to understand the NDIS, to understand their plan, to fully engage in the supports that have been funded, which then leads to good utilisation of the plan. And then when they have their next review meeting, the planner comes in and goes, it looks like everything's working really well. Is there anything that you need adjusted? And it's a much easier discussion than when someone comes home and you're fighting because they don't have enough support and they're trying to manage with something that they still haven't fully even accepted, because it's usually within that first 12 months and they're still coming to terms with the fact that, I've got a spinal cord injury or I've got this other disability now. And it's not just them, their whole family has to adjust to this new person, especially people that often have young kids that, the kids kind of have to adjust to, Dad can't come and kick a soccer ball with me anymore. And it's how do we get those people that good funding? And it does come down to that the hospitals usually do a really good holistic approach of this is who the person was before their injury and before their disability, and this is where they want to get to, and here's the first step that we need to take. And the NDIS usually will fund quite well, because I think they have finally listened to, especially with spinal cord injury, that first 18 months is really, really important. And they know if they spend the money now in that first initial plan and probably the initial 2 plans, that they're going to potentially spend less money over the rest of that person's life. So they kind of have come on board with that recently, which has been really nice.
Yeah, I think having to explain your disability to someone who has no clear idea on your disability and has quite clearly not read the reports that you've put in front of them is just demoralizing, and it does burn people out. Parents of children or family members, brothers and sisters who are trying to help their person get onto the NDIS or get funded fairly are just burning out and at the point of wit's ends where they can't do anymore, can't cope with anymore, and it all just falls apart, and it puts that person at severe risk of harm. So having that education, getting the planning right at the first stages will make a big difference to the follow-on effects of the reviews and then the external reviews at the AAT. If we can get it right at the beginning, we can change the whole follow-on effect.
Yeah, I think just generally speaking, that burnout is just being felt across the board. All service providers, coordinators, participants themselves, we're finding ourselves in a situation now where people who have had similar sort of NDIS plans the last few years are now coming back with their plans reduced, and there's no explanation as to why suddenly they don't need as much care when they've always needed that same amount of care. And just having to go through all of the review processes and the stress that it puts on the family, and what do I do if they don't fund the support I need, and and for people who have had not the best experience with NDIS over the course of the last few years, potentially with things being declined. As an example, I've got a participant at the moment who we're needing to go through AAT for, but in the last few years, we've had to fight for everything, and this person's just almost lost the drive to even go through to fight, and it's for something that shouldn't even be in question with regards to equipment. So we are seeing it across the board, and it's having that effect on the participants who just don't have the energy to go through the AAT process to get the equipment they need.
So we've mentioned the AAT, but we actually haven't explained what the AAT is.
Yeah, so if you were to get a plan back that was underfunded, you would do your S100 or review of a reviewable decision review, and that's called the internal review. And then if that still comes back underfunded, you then have 28 days to lodge to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to have your case heard as an external review. The AAT is completely independent from the NDIS, and they will look at the Act and look at that against your plan. AATs do take a long time. They do use up a lot of energy, and the NDIS is always represented by a legal team. A drastic power imbalance because participants are not always represented. You can self-represent at the AAT, or you can be represented by a disability advocate, or on occasions legal aid. But we are seeing across the board that these services are at capacity. There has been, I think, a 400% increase of matters going to the AAT in the last 12 months. And people just are getting plan cuts for no reason, with no justification, and things are ending up in AAT that shouldn't have even been rejected at the first instance.
Mel, how long was your participant in going through the AAT for before they, or have they?
This one, we've just lodged the application. But if I can just point out how ridiculous this case is, because the request is for a companion bed that cost us $3,500. Now, if you look at the time that I've spent supporting this participant through the review processes to date, the OT reports, now we're talking legal fees for $3,500, we would have already paid for the bed in the support that myself and the OT have provided, let alone what's to come.
Yeah, the Senate figures on the legal costs for the NDIS around AAT between last financial year and this financial year are mind-blowing. So I think it was...
Absolutely.
It was around, I think, $17 million in the 2020 to 21 financial year, and this financial year, and I think it cut off at the end of April, so it's not even the full financial year. It's somewhere like $45.5 million. So it's ridiculous. And yeah, I can't see how the supports would have been more expensive than the $45 million spent just on the legal. That's only the legal cost. Yeah, it's not the support coordinator cost, the additional OT reports, the time that people have to go to their GPs perhaps to get extra evidence, and that then is a cost to the health system.
Absolutely, and a cost to the participants' plan, because they have to keep getting these updated reports and more and more and more at their own cost in their plan. So it's taking away from supports that they could be utilising to write reports.
like no matter what participant, whether they're going into the AAT or not. We often talk or often hear about how the NDIS is at a blowout. And we often hear about how the NDIS is on the cusp of like being at a blowout or a deficit or something along the lines of billions of dollars have been spent. And so to that point, clearly the amount of time it's taken for somebody to go through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal or any time somebody gets a review is costing more and more where they could have just funded it. I mean, there would be no reason why somebody would go to this level to go to the AAT or even go to numerous reviews if it weren't that important to them.
I would just add in that the NDIS is estimated to leave the economy $52 billion better off, and it delivers $2.25 for every dollar spent. So it's not, in my point of view, it's not a blowout. It's actually very good. The estimates that will be about 10,200 jobs lost for every $1 billion cut from NDIS plans. So that's a lot of jobs.
Yeah. I think for me, it's kind of about, and I guess because I've worked under ADDIC funding and under NDIS funding, and fairly similar, like while it wasn't support coordination under ADDIC, it was helping people to look at their funding that they had from ADDIC and decide how they wanted to use it, but it was just as a provider. Essentially, like even though people got a new funding plan if they were on an individual package, they got a new plan every 12 months, but essentially their case manager at ADDIC would say, hey, has anything changed? And if it hadn't, they would go, okay, great, here's your plan. And it was a really simple process, whereas now every year, and I know like the NDIS is trying to lengthen plans out to be longer to cut back on some of the need to, like you don't have to get your review report annually, you can get it every 2 years or 3 years if you've got a 3-year plan. But the assumption was if nothing had changed, you just continued on as you were.
And we're talking about how good it is for the economy that it's happened, but what are some of the easiest and or hardest supports there are to try and like argue for or to try and get through an NDIS plan that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think Louise might have touched on this earlier as well, but just in terms of NDIS not funding rehab, so we see all the time when participants are discharged from hospital, they're not quite at their full functional capacity yet. So we do see them coming out of doing intense rehab and then suddenly dropping down to 1 physio a week when they were doing multiple a day in rehab and still not being at the point that they want to be at. I've got like a case, like a client who actually went through the AAT to get this extended rehab through their NDIS plan. And since having that has improved their function to the point that they're now able to use a manual wheelchair where they were in a power wheelchair before. So we are still seeing these changes, but it's really hard to get the NDIS to see the benefits of somebody continuing that rehab that will decrease their supports in future if they can continue on to a certain point.
And possibly get into a workforce or...
Exactly right, yeah. I think the other thing that I do find quite challenging sometimes is NDIS don't fund for in case. And we see this a lot with perhaps people who are prone to wounds for nursing care. Like there's generally no question asked if you need catheter changes or trachea changes. They'll be funded straight away in your plan. But when we say, look, this person's prone to wounds, we might need 20 hours for wound care assessments or nursing as things pop up over the next 12 months. And that's generally not going to be funded because we'll be told, submit a change of circumstance if that happens and we'll review your plan. Whereas that's a lot to go through for somebody who's suddenly got a wound pop up and they need nursing to come in every couple of days and you've got no funding there to actually access the service.
At this moment in time, I think it's psychology is coming across as the biggest one, and the crossover with the mental health care plan, and just the limited understanding by the NDIS that the care plan doesn't cover disability support. It covers the clinical mental health, and that's where it's going wrong, because instantly when someone asks for psychology sessions, they're instantly told to use the mental health care plan. And not to mention that there is quite a large gap fee in utilising the mental health care plan that, some people just can't afford.
We had a planner once say, like, oh, do you need a wheelchair? And the client was like, Yes. Like, it was just, afterwards she was like, why can't, like, she's like, I really miss being able to go into an NDIS office because that question would never have been asked, because they would have been in their wheelchair and it would have been very obvious to the planner that they need a wheelchair. But yeah, just some things that, like, planners very obviously don't have education around certain disabilities. And I get that, like, it would be really hard to be across everything, but there used to be like a spinal cord team. I met with one of the planners once and she was fantastic because she didn't ask things like, do you have a wheelchair? She didn't assume, oh, you're quadriplegic, you'll have a power wheelchair. She asked, what sort of wheelchair do you have, so that I can appropriately, request the right amount of repairs and maintenance for that over the next plan. So you kind of got more targeted questions and it made a difference to the plan that person got. So it would be really nice to kind of see, maybe, at each office they have specialists in different types of disabilities that can share the information with the team internally. So it's not like you're requiring on all of Australia accessing one team for spinal cord injury, but, each office has an expert that champions a particular type of disability that the rest of the team can go to and say, hey, I've got a planning meeting coming up with someone with quadriplegia. What should I know ahead of time?
I think one thing that's come up for me recently, just going through a plan review process, we had a very comprehensive nursing report submitted. And it was a high funding package, which sort of means that the general planner was unable to approve it. So it goes through to what they call the technical team, which is usually seen by multiple allied health professionals look at each report, supposedly. So in this case, we had the technical team coming back to the planner, to the LAC, through to myself to ask a question about the nursing report, which was already in the report anyway. And we're going through all these different channels trying to get the information to one person. And all it took in the end to resolve after submitting a complaint was the technical team to ring the nurse and say, hey, what do you mean by this? And then the plan was approved the next day and everything was sorted. But just having that communication where they talk directly to who they need the information from as well, just to speed up that process and to actually get the information that they need rather than it coming through all the different channels, I think would be really beneficial too.
Yeah. Also, following on off that is educating the allied health professionals and the GPs and all of the people who support and write letters and reports for the NDIS to actually know how to write an NDIS report and know what the NDIS is actually looking for in that report, knowing Section 34 of the Act and what is classed as reasonable and necessary. There's no training for that. I speak to GPs about people's access, and the GPs, they don't have any idea. That's not their forte. That's not their job. But, it could be made seamless with just some education and training for the allied health professionals and the doctors and everybody to know exactly what NDIS are looking for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And often we see planners come back and ask for, can you get a letter from your GP or a report for your specialist to verify that? And yeah, quite often the GPs come back with one or two lines on a page that doesn't address anything near what the NDIA is asking for. So that is a really good point, April, having that education available or resources for GPs and specialists too.
And I think also on GPs, realizing that they are often overworked, and so having the person book maybe a double appointment and say, hey, when I come in, we need to write this letter together for the NDIS, because I've in the past worked in occupational rehabilitation, and we would often attend a doctor's appointment with someone where you could educate the doctor on, look, this is what the medical certificate needs to say for the insurance company to accept it so that this person gets benefits. So, as a support coordinator, we could also link in with the person and their GP potentially to kind of educate. But it would be really good if the NDIS actually had open and easily available resources on, this is how we want a GP to provide the information that we require.
When you're going to the GP and you're writing it alongside the GP, you're almost having to learn the GP's job, your job as a participant, and then how that filters into the other services that you're accessing, their jobs, and then how it all comes together. So you're taking on the job of you as a participant and like at least 5 other services. You're not even a subject matter expert on like their specific service that they provide, but somehow need to know a lot about that person's profession to then take it to another person's profession and then come all together just so you can have the right reports for your plan. Yeah, so training and education is extremely important.
And I think like a lot of it, when you're looking at training health professionals and allied health professionals, the NDIS needs to be the one providing that training because they're the ones that have the criteria. So they need to say, this is our criteria. Here is a template on how to write a GP letter for access. Just fill it in with the person's specific details.
Yeah, especially with, past treatment history, and they want to know all the treatments that have been trialled. They don't want the GP to just write all available treatments have been trialled because the NDIS just knocked that back straight away. But the GP doesn't know that they need to actually sit there and spend half an hour writing every single medication, surgery, everything that that participant has been through to say all available medical treatments have been trialled. Little things like that make a big impact on the person either getting access or the person getting the funds.
Saying to the NDIS planner that raised the question of, wouldn't still be more appropriate for this person than in-home care when they need 2-to-1 and 24/7 hour support.
So we might have to explain what SIL means.
Supported independent living. So it's having the residents could be in a specialist disability accommodation facility, or it could be a public rental, or it could be a housing property, but you have a care provider that comes in. It's usually shared between more than one person with a disability. So they're basically taking away a lot of choice and control on where someone wants to live and how they want to live. So this person that I'm talking about, that we've had them come back and question it, he currently is married and has adult children and wants to live in the home that he bought with his compensation money to be wheelchair accessible post-disability. So he wants to remain living in that home as long as possible. He's aware that he may need to go into more specialist care as he ages, but at the moment there's funding that can be met, and historically it's been provided by the NDIS. But this year, they made a compensation reduction assessment and basically said, we're going to halve your plan, and then that went through a review. His lawyers are doing some stuff in the law system to go alongside what we're doing within the NDIS so that everything's ticked off, because it potentially will at some point go to the AAT. But the planner has actually come back and said, we can see that he has already spent his compensation money. He has used it for disability-related needs, so we will reinstate the care funding. But they were still trying to push him into SIL, knowing that he's used his compensation to buy a fully accessible home, which they haven't had to modify because he's done all of that himself with his money. And then they're kind of trying to say, well, he doesn't need to live there anymore. He can go into a SIL property. Yeah, we really had to push back on, well, that's actually not what he wants.
It's really hard. And like the sort of participants we work with, I would say that probably 70% of mine have more than 6 hours of support a day. So to think that we have to go through this for everybody, and none of my participants are in a SIL or SDA arrangement, they all live privately in their own homes. Yeah, so that's quite scary to think we've got to go through this for everybody.
And I think as well, especially with the whole, let's just put you in SIL because it's more cost effective, they're not looking at the person as a whole. They're just going, you can go to SIL because it's better, but they don't look at where they're already living, who's living with them, and what their preferences are. I absolutely would not want to go into a share home in my late 30s. I want to live on my own in my own space and be cranky. You're saying to people, okay, well, you've got to now live with people who you don't know, who are not related to you, and that you don't necessarily have choice in who they are.
Oh my gosh, I was just going to say choice and control. The key phrases, choice and control and reasonable and necessary, are just always at a heads. When it comes to, you should be able to live in a house that is accessible because you made it accessible to yourself.
If anything happens to me, I want to keep living with my partner and my daughter. I don't want to have to live with strangers.
Yeah, look, it's crazy that we have to keep having this conversation, and now this is literally the third podcast that we've spoken about when it comes to the NDIS, and people seem to not get enough of it because it's something that's so important to so many people, but it's always given very negative press for something that's actually done very well for itself, and then also the community. And like you say, April, makes like a substantially better financial investment into local business, into smaller business, into sole traders.
And like the amount of care workers, like they can't find enough staff now. So what does that say about the industry? Like, I know part of it is that it relied a lot on international students, and we haven't had an influx of them for the last couple of years, but you know, it's a good job if you're a mum and you want to do something in between school hours, because a lot of people's support will be between 9 and 3, or, you know, it's different times, and you can fit it in around school pickup and drop off. It's really flexible if you want it to be. Coming up to the election, I made the mistake of reading the comment section on an ABC News article about the NDIS, and the amount of people who were just there going, well, people are just, you know, being fraudulent. And I'm like, this is workers' compensation all over again. I don't think I've really worked with anyone that I would consider is making unreasonable requests of the NDIS.
And especially going to that level for a very seemingly small expense to then fight so hard for it. We should probably educate the wider society as to what goes into an NDIS fund and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah.
I remember reading one article where somebody said down the bottom, it was a woman who was saying that she needed $15,000, and this was before the mid-AT funding. She needed $15,000 for a wheelchair. But a comment underneath said, why would a wheelchair cost $15,000? Or why does she need to have a wheelchair that costs $15,000? What a waste of money. People don't know. They've never met anybody in a wheelchair. They don't know what sort of things go into actually scripting a wheelchair, which is what we came back to in the first part of this podcast. It's really more of it's an education on every level.
And I think as well, like educating people on, it's not just care workers and it's not just allied health, it's gardeners, it's cleaners, it's builders, handymen are coming in and getting paid to do odd jobs for people because they can't do them for themselves. You know, you're in a wheelchair, how do you change your light globes? You need someone to come in and do it for you. And so odd jobs guys are getting extra work. We employ heaps of them indirectly through our clients.
Like, there's a lot of positive things that we see coming out of the NDIS, and a lot of that you know, comes down to having the right supports around you and understanding how you can use your plan and to achieve the things that you need to achieve. There's probably a lot of people that don't know that they can potentially use supports for handymen to come into their homes. So, you know, a lot of these positive outcomes that we're seeing from people, it's because they've got that right support network around them to help them to achieve the goals.
What happens if somebody needs to go to the AAT and they can't actually represent, like I can't physically be there or can't represent themselves? Now, April, you've talked about how like the NDIS already have lawyers that will be there to represent them on their behalf. What are some of the issues that can arise for a participant who just doesn't have access?
So they can get free advice sessions from legal aid. Is a solicitor looks over all the documents and evidence and advises them on their case. They can go to Ask Izzy and find a disability advocate in their area. At this point in time, most agencies, most advocates are at capacity, so it would look like being waitlisted. When you lodge to the AAT, at this moment it's about 4 months wait to even get your first case conference. So the times have blown out.
My next question was going to be, how long does it take to get something over the line? But apparently it takes 4 months to even get there. So
it takes 4 months to even get there. You know, we are seeing it get quicker, which is good. In my experience, I would normally say to clients, prepare for about a year in AAT.
Okay, so Mel, back to your client with the companion bed for $3,500. Let's say they're gonna wait like, I don't know, 4 months to be able to get there. I mean, this is all part of the burnout, right? Like, this is...
Yeah, exactly. And for a participant to not be able to have that comfort and support from their husband through the evening and the night, and potentially needing increased care support because you know, their partner is now having to sleep in another room and not there through the night, who might be able to do little tasks for her. Like, there's just a lot of other factors that come into play for such a simple fix for this person, and the emotional support from being able to lie next to your husband every night. Like, instead of sleeping in separate rooms, it's just phenomenal.
Yeah. And it usually means they end up in hospital instead of being able to be cared for in their home.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like you just can't even bear to think about somebody who can't access an advocate because they're all at capacity and they don't have a support coordinator and they don't have formal, like, informal supports who are available to help them. Like, what, you just can't bear to think about what those people end up doing or just giving up because it's too hard.
And in the meantime, if you've run out of funds and you're waiting on that decision, it puts people in a really tough place as well, because the NDIA won't want to approve a new plan while the AAT case is open.
We were going to, when we were putting this episode together, we were going to give people advice about where to go for legal help and support if they are, needing to get to that level in their NDIS plan. But as you've said, legal aid is at capacity. Disability Advocacy Finder at capacity. Is there any examples in any other states around Australia that isn't just New South Wales that might have some capacity?
No.
Okay.
Recently, like when we've been looking, because even though we know advocacy organisations are at capacity, we still call them just to check, because someone could have pulled out or decided to withdraw their AAT case, or, suddenly they've got a new advocate recruited. So we do call regularly when people need an advocate just in case. And what we found lately is some of them will say, look, we can't actually help you with going all the way to AAT, but we can give you a 1-hour session where we can talk you through your case, what you need to do. And then we can keep you on a wait list so that if we have someone available before your hearing comes up, that we would be able to help you. So that, I guess, is somewhat helpful. And then legal aid will still do the free information sessions as well, but it's an hour. So, yeah, you kind of get an hour with something that's going to take months and months, possibly 12 months out of your life. And, I know if it was me, I would need to get someone to help me through it. I wouldn't be able to work out what to do on my own.
They can utilise the funds that they have to get supports that they need, and then we can ask the NDIS and the tribunal for a 42D remittal to have the plan refreshed, and that's at the discretion of the agency approving that for the sole reasons of allowed access to funds while the tribunal is still in proceedings. That's things we've done in the past to have that plan refreshed. It'll usually only be a 6-month plan that they will agree to. So and usually they're longer than 6 months, you've got to go through that process every time you're close to running out of funding. And what makes it even harder, as I said before, they've got to use that funding to provide the reports for the AAT and the NDIS.
Took the words out of my mouth, April.
It's so expensive, it's so time consuming, and it's so hard on the participant.
Put yourself on the wait list of a bunch of different advocacy organisations, because if you're on the wait list for everyone, you might actually get somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it shouldn't even be a question that for somebody who's getting their first NDIS plan, no matter what their disability is, they should have a support coordinator. Even if it is just for the first year or 2 years, to get them the supports that they need, help them to understand the plan, how to achieve their goals, what they can use their funding on, get them sort of set up to a point where they might be able to manage it themselves. That would just relieve a lot of pressure on the participants and help them just to set them up really for success. In adding to that, a lot of the time we see the first plans that come through are either not adequate or they're interim plans. So we get the plan and we have a look at it and what the supports are needed, and straight away we know, well, this isn't going to last you. So we've got to set aside a certain amount of hours to help you prepare for a review and get the reports you need to be funded the services that you require. A lot of the time, a first plan, that's how we're spending our time, is helping them to understand what's been funded, what exactly it is that they need and what they asked for in their planning meeting, and then do we need to review.
And on that, it needs to be an appropriate amount of hours for a first plan, because I've had a few come through lately where it's someone's first plan and they've got 24 hours. So that's an hour a fortnight for someone that has, potentially a new disability, no contact with any care agencies, any allied health. They don't even know, newly injured people will often say to you, people ask us if we need this, but we don't know if we need that. I've never had a spinal cord injury before. How do I know what assistive tech I need to help me use my computer at home. What is even out there? And no one kind of sits down and says, here's all the different things you can plug into your computer to make it easier to use now. There's no one that can kind of give that information to someone. So it's kind of similar to the NDIS. If you don't know what you need, then how do you know how to use your funding? And like, we find people at the start, they'll need like a couple of hours a week to kind of, because they just have so many questions, you know, can we do this? My husband would usually look after all of the gardening at home. It's been raining a lot. Everything's really overgrown. We've been told we can't use his plan while he's in hospital, but we really need a gardener. So there's a lot of things like that people are really overwhelmed by their whole situation. And then the NDIS is really confusing.
It's crazy that we have to keep having this conversation, and now this is literally the third podcast that we've spoken about when it comes to the NDIS. And people seem to not get enough of it because it's something that's so important to so many people.
Look, there needs to be a change, and the NDIS does need to be looked at and scrutinised. We are hopeful that there will be change. We are hopeful that, you know, the NDIS can return to a really good system that works really well, because for some people, the NDIS is amazing, and there is so many good stories coming out of the NDIS. But unfortunately, for a lot of people that we see, the NDIS just isn't working and is really causing people severe harm, a risk of harm. And we just need that change to happen. We need the positivity to come back to the NDIS, and the faith and the trust in the system to be returned.
I will say that, like, there has been one change recently with NDIS with regards to equipment, and like, it's been really positive for my participants, just that mid-cost equipment that's now a little bit easier for people to access. And, you know, we've seen some really good results with that, with equipment that maybe previously would have taken 6 months to get approved is now coming through, you know, within a few weeks. It's just made that in itself has just been, you know, really beneficial to our clients as well. So hopefully they can keep making these sorts of changes, and it'll just streamline everything and make it a bit easier for everybody.
Yeah, I think the mid-cost AT change has been really positive. I've got a client who's been asking for a sports wheelchair for 3 years and keeps getting declined because you don't need 2 wheelchairs. And we just had a planning meeting this week, and the LAC basically was like, oh, yeah, that'll be fine. It's under the benchmark of $12,500. We'll give you the full 15. You can use the gap for repairs and maintenance on it over the next 12 months. And that was really positive. I guess for me, I keep going back to, like at the start of the NDIS, it was aimed at giving people more choices, more freedom, more flexibility. And that's something that it did exist at the start, but we've lost it in the last couple of years. That, you know, you used to just go in and say, this is what I need, and the planner would go, great, I may not be able to approve everything based on reasonable and necessary, but I'll do what I can. And people had faith in those planners, and generally the plans came back and they were what people needed. You know, in 5 years, I used to at the start do maybe 3 or 4 review requests over the course of 6 months, say. Whereas now, especially in the last 12 months, I would say like 70% of plans have had something that wasn't what the participant needed. So there would be something where we went, the planner very clearly hasn't read the reports and hasn't listened to what the person was actually saying they need.
Yeah, work from the grassroots up. Work with the people that this system is meant to work for, and find out what they need and what they want, and have more representation of people with disability in the higher senior roles. There is a lot more that could change about the NDIS. I could go on all day, but to start with consultation about how we help people and how we support the people with disabilities the best, that is a really good start.
You've been listening to Have the Nerve. If you like what you hear, please give this podcast a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you need any assistance with your support coordination, SCIA provides this service for people living all over Australia, no matter what disability. You can visit scia.org.au for more details about our support coordination service, and you can also find our other episodes on the Resource Hub. Thank you for listening.